June 22, 1941, Odessa, Soviet Union. 24-year-old Lyudmila Pavlichenko stands in a recruiting office trying to convince a Soviet army officer that she should be allowed to join a combat rifle unit, not be relegated to nursing duties like every other woman volunteering. Operation Barbarossa began hours ago. German forces are pouring across the Soviet border, and Pavlichenko knows her nation needs every capable defender. The recruiting officer looks skeptical. This small Ukrainian woman with dark hair and intense eyes, a history student at Kyiv University, who claims she can shoot. Pavlichenko doesn't argue with words. She pulls out her Voroshilov sharpshooter certification, evidence that she spent years training with the WWII shooting club, that she competed in marksmanship competitions, that she can hit targets most men cannot. The officer remains unconvinced until Pavlichenko makes him an offer he cannot refuse. "Give me a rifle and one chance. Put up a target at 200 meters. If I miss, assign me to nursing. If I hit, give me a combat posting." The officer agrees, certain this will end quickly. Pavlichenko doesn't just hit the target. She puts 3 rounds through the center mass in rapid succession, grouping so tight the holes overlap. The recruiting officer stares at the target, then at this young woman who handles a Mosin Nagant rifle like it's an extension of her body. Within hours, Pavlichenko receives orders to report to the 25th Chapaya Rifle Division, defending Odessa as a sniper, one of the first women in Soviet history to be assigned a frontline combat role. She packs her few possessions, says goodbye to her young son, who will stay with relatives, and heads to the front lines, carrying a scoped Mosin Nagant rifle that weighs almost as much as she does. Her unit's male snipers view her arrival with mixture of curiosity and contempt. Some make crude jokes about sending a woman to do a soldier's job. Others simply ignore her, assuming she'll request transfer to rear areas after seeing real combat. None of them imagine that this quiet history student will become the most successful female sniper in military history, a woman German soldiers will come to call der weibliche Tod, the Lady Death. Pavlichenko's first combat action occurs on her second day at the front, August 1941, in defensive positions outside Odessa. German and Romanian forces are advancing toward the city, and Soviet defenders dig in to slow them. Pavlichenko takes position in a partially collapsed building, her rifle resting on rubble that provides both cover and a stable shooting platform. Through her 3.5 by PU scope, she watches German soldiers advancing in small groups through the ruins 400 meters away. Her spotter, a veteran sergeant named Leonid Kitsenko, who initially protested being paired with a woman, whispers range estimates and wind calls, but Pavlichenko barely needs them. She's been shooting since age 14, knows how to read wind by watching dust and grass movement, understands ballistic trajectory instinctively. She centers your crosshairs on a German soldier who appears to be an officer, based on his gestures directing others. The Mosin Nagant's trigger breaks cleanly. Through the scope, Pavlichenko sees the German officer fall. The first kill hits Pavlichenko harder than she expected, despite years of target shooting and mental preparation. The scope magnification means she sees the man's face in the instant before impact, sees him become a person rather than a target, and when he falls, she knows she's taken a life. Her hands shake as she works the rifle bolt to chamber another round. Kitsenko notices her hesitation and asks if she's okay. Pavlichenko takes a deep breath, forces herself to focus. This is war. These men invaded her homeland, are killing Soviet citizens, will kill her if given the chance. She centers her crosshairs on another German soldier. This time, her hands don't shake. By the end of that first day's engagement, Pavlichenko has killed 2 German soldiers at ranges exceeding 400 meters. Kitsenko, who began the day skeptical of his female partner, returns to their unit telling anyone who will listen that the university girl can shoot better than half the men in the battalion. The early weeks of Pavlichenko's combat service establish patterns that will define her sniper career. She operates primarily during daylight hours, taking positions in ruins or natural cover where she can observe German positions without being detected. Her kills come primarily at ranges between 300 and 500 meters, distances where the Mosin-Nagant's accuracy remains excellent, but where German soldiers feel relatively safe from rifle fire. Pavlichenko learns to identify high-value targets, including officers, NCOs, artillery spotters, and enemy snipers. Each kill is recorded in her military logbook with date, time, range, and target description. Documentation that Soviet command requires, but which also helps Pavlichenko process the psychological weight of taking lives. Within 3 weeks, her confirmed kill count reaches 15, making her one of the most successful snipers in the Odessa defense. German forces besieging Odessa begin noticing that their officers and key personnel are dying from single shots fired from unknown positions. Wehrmacht counter-sniper doctrine involves deploying specialized Sharpschützen to hunt enemy snipers, and soon German marksmen are specifically tasked with finding and eliminating the sniper or snipers operating in the ruins around Odessa. Pavlichenko has several near encounters with German counter-snipers during September 1941. Exchanges where both sides are hunting each other through devastated buildings and shattered streets. She survives these encounters with discipline and patience, never taking shots that might reveal her position unless the target value justifies the risk, always having 2 or 3 fallback positions planned before firing her first round. By October 1941, when Soviet forces evacuate Odessa by sea to reinforce Sevastopol, Pavlichenko's confirmed kill count reaches 187. The university history student who had to prove herself to a skeptical recruiting officer has killed more enemy soldiers in 4 months than most riflemen kill in entire wars, and she's only beginning what will become one of the most remarkable combat careers of World War II. November 1941. Sevastopol, Crimea. Lyudmila Pavlichenko takes up new defensive positions after the evacuation from Odessa, joining the 54th Regiment, defending this critical Black Sea port against German and Romanian siege forces. Her reputation has preceded her. 187 confirmed kills makes her already one of the most successful Soviet snipers, and her unit commanders give her considerable freedom to select positions and targets. But Sevastopol proves different from Odessa in ways that make Pavlichenko's work far more dangerous. The Germans have learned that Soviet snipers are devastating their officer corps and disrupting operations, and they've responded by deploying dedicated counter-sniper teams, Scharfschützen, trained specifically to hunt enemy marksmen. Wehrmacht intelligence has compiled lists of known Soviet snipers based on intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations, and Pavlichenko's name appears prominently. German officers brief their counter-snipers that a female sniper is operating in the Sevastopol defenses with nearly 200 confirmed kills, offering extra rations and leave time to whoever eliminates her. The hunt for Lady Death has officially begun. Pavlichenko's first encounter with a German counter-sniper occurs in late November during the opening phases of the Sevastopol siege. She's positioned in the ruins of a factory building, overlooking German approach routes, when her spotter notices something wrong. A German soldier who appears too casual, moving through exposed areas without the caution most infantry show. Pavlichenko recognizes the behavior immediately. This is bait, a decoy meant to draw her shot and reveal her position. She scans the area methodically through her scope, looking for the hunter using this soldier as lure. After 20 minutes of patient observation, she spots him. A reflection of sunlight off glass in a destroyed building 450 meters away, a German sniper waiting for her to take the bait. Pavlichenko faces a decision that will recur throughout Sevastopol. She can remain hidden and safe, or she can engage in a duel where both snipers are hunting each other. She chooses to engage, but on her terms. Rather than shooting at the German sniper's position, she waits another hour until the German, thinking the Soviet sniper has moved on, begins repositioning. The moment he moves into a window opening, Pavlichenko fires. The German sniper falls, killed by a woman he was hunting but never saw. The counter-sniper war in Sevastopol becomes a deadly chess game where both sides employ increasingly sophisticated tactics. German snipers work in pairs, with one serving as spotter and the other as shooter, exactly like Soviet doctrine. They use natural camouflage, build elaborate hides, and employ decoys to draw fire. Pavlichenko adapts by never taking predictable positions, constantly changing her firing locations, and refusing to shoot at targets unless the risk calculation favors her. She learns to identify German sniper hides by tiny details, unnatural shadows, vegetation that doesn't match surroundings, positions with excellent fields of fire but only one escape route. Her spotter Kitsenko, now completely devoted to keeping her alive, becomes expert at reading terrain and spotting threats. Together, they operate as a nearly perfect team, with Kitsenko handling observation and wind calls, while Pavlichenko focuses purely on shooting. By December 1941, Pavlichenko's confirmed kill count includes 15 enemy snipers, making her as feared among German marksmen as she is among regular infantry. The psychological warfare intensifies as Germans realize they're facing an exceptional opponent. Wehrmacht units begin broadcasting propaganda over loudspeakers directed at Soviet positions, specifically targeting Pavlichenko by name. German officers who speak Russian call out to her, "Lyudmila Pavlichenko, we know you're there. We've sent our best snipers to find you. Surrender now and we'll treat you well. Come over to our side and you'll be rich." Some broadcasts are crude attempts at intimidation. "We'll catch you eventually, Russian girl. When we do, you'll wish you surrendered." Pavlichenko responds the only way that matters, by continuing to kill German soldiers. After one particularly offensive broadcast promising that German soldiers would show her what happens to women who forget their place, Pavlichenko puts 2 rounds through the loudspeaker at 500 meters, silencing it permanently. Her unit cheers, and word of the incident spreads through Soviet defenses, boosting morale beyond any propaganda officer could achieve. The Sevastopol siege grinds on through winter 1941-1942, and Pavlichenko operates in conditions that test even the most hardened soldiers. Temperatures drop below freezing. Artillery fire is constant. German forces gradually tighten the encirclement, making resupply difficult and evacuation impossible. Pavlichenko continues hunting, now reaching into the 250s for confirmed kills, but the physical and psychological toll accumulates. She's wounded twice by shell fragments during artillery barrages, minor injuries that she refuses to let remove her from duty. She watches friends die, sees her regiment decimated by German assaults, and experiences the grinding exhaustion of siege warfare where there's no rear area, no true rest, only degrees of danger. Through it all, she maintains her sniper discipline, never taking unnecessary risks, always calculating whether a shot is worth revealing her position. Soviet command recognizes her value not just as a killer, but as a symbol, and officers begin keeping her away from the most suicidal defensive positions, understanding that losing Pavlichenko would damage morale significantly. By June 1942, as the Sevastopol siege enters its final desperate phase, Pavlichenko's confirmed kill count has reached 309, making her the most successful female sniper in history, and one of the top snipers of any gender in the Soviet military. But the siege is clearly lost. German forces have brought overwhelming firepower to bear, and Soviet defenses are collapsing section by section. Soviet command makes the difficult decision to evacuate key personnel by submarine before the final collapse, and Pavlichenko, despite her protests that she should remain with her regiment, is ordered to leave. The reasoning is pragmatic and brutal. She's more valuable alive as a propaganda symbol and training instructor than dead as another casualty in a doomed defense. On June 25, 1942, Pavlichenko boards a submarine that will take her from Sevastopol to safety, leaving behind the siege that consumed 8 months of her life and where she killed over 120 German soldiers. She leaves as a senior lieutenant, a decorated hero, and a legend among both Soviet soldiers who served with her and German soldiers who survived encounters with der weiblichen Tat. The history student from the Kiev University who had to prove she could shoot has become Lady Death, a woman whose rifle killed more enemy soldiers than entire companies managed in some engagements, and whose story is just beginning its transformation into myth. August 1942, Washington, D.C. Lyudmila Pavlichenko stands in the White House wearing a Soviet military uniform with her medals prominently displayed, trying to process the surreal transformation from Sevastopol's killing fields to American diplomatic reception rooms. Just weeks ago, she was shooting German soldiers at 500 meters. Now she's shaking hands with Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States, as part of a Soviet goodwill delegation designed to encourage American support for opening a second front against Germany. The Soviet government selected Pavlichenko specifically for this tour because her story combines everything Stalin wants Americans to know about the Soviet war effort: heroism, sacrifice, and most importantly, proof that the USSR mobilizes everyone, including women, to fight fascism. But American officials and journalists don't quite know what to make of this small, intense Ukrainian woman who speaks bluntly about killing 309 German soldiers. Eleanor Roosevelt will later write that Pavlichenko is the most fascinating woman she has ever met, a combination of feminine grace and deadly efficiency that challenges every American assumption about women and war. The American press immediately fixates on Pavlichenko's gender rather than her combat achievements, a reaction that infuriates her from the first press conference. American reporters ask about her uniform appearance, whether she wears makeup in combat, how she maintains feminine charm while killing people. One journalist asks if Soviet women are allowed to wear long skirts in civilian life. Another inquires whether her military service has made it difficult to find romantic interests. Pavlichenko's patience snaps during a Chicago press conference when a reporter asks yet again about her uniform rather than her combat experience. She responds with barely controlled anger through her translator. "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old, and at the front I have already destroyed 309 fascist invaders by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long? This statement, delivered with the flat affect of someone describing basic facts rather than boasting, silences the room and gets quoted in newspapers across America. American audiences are forced to confront uncomfortable truths. This young woman has killed more enemy soldiers than entire American companies will kill in battles yet to come. And American men are indeed still sitting safely at home, while Soviets die by the millions fighting Hitler. Eleanor Roosevelt takes Pavlichenko under her personal sponsorship, recognizing both the propaganda value and the genuine human story of this Soviet sniper. The First Lady invites Pavlichenko to stay at the White House on several occasions, and the two women develop an unlikely friendship, despite language barriers and radically different backgrounds. Roosevelt is fascinated by Pavlichenko's matter-of-fact descriptions of combat, her technical explanations of sniping tactics, and her complete lack of sentimentality about killing enemy soldiers. Pavlichenko, in turn, is amazed by American abundance, the food, the consumer goods, the casual wealth that even middle-class Americans possess. She writes in letters back to Soviet contacts that Americans have so much they waste more food in a day than Soviet soldiers receive in a week. But they don't seem to understand what's happening in Europe, don't grasp that entire cities are being destroyed, that millions are dying. The friendship becomes genuine, with Roosevelt later sending Pavlichenko a Colt pistol as a personal gift, a weapon Pavlichenko treasures for the rest of her life. Pavlichenko's speaking tour takes her across America, addressing union rallies, civic organizations, and fundraising events. Her speeches, delivered through translators but with emotional intensity that needs no translation, focus on opening the Second Front and recognizing Soviet sacrifices. At the International Student Assembly in Washington, she delivers what becomes her most famous address. I am 25 years old. At the front, I have already destroyed 309 fascist invaders. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long? She tells American audiences that Soviet women are fighting and dying while American men debate whether to commit forces. The speeches are brutally effective, shaming American isolationists and energizing support for Allied intervention in Europe. But Pavlichenko also describes the cost of war in ways that make comfortable Americans uncomfortable. She talks about watching friends die, about cities reduced to rubble, about the grinding exhaustion of combat that never ends. American audiences came expecting a curiosity, a woman soldier they could marvel at. Instead, they encounter someone who makes them confront the reality that their Soviet allies are bleeding to death while America debates. The propaganda tour also exposes Pavlichenko to America's racial segregation, which she finds both shocking and hypocritical. During a stop in Mississippi, she insists on meeting with African American groups despite objections from local officials who warn her about violating segregation customs. Pavlichenko, who fought alongside soldiers of multiple ethnicities in the Soviet military, cannot understand why Americans claim to fight for freedom while denying basic rights to their own citizens based on skin color. She makes pointed comments in speeches about how the Soviet Union treats all citizens equally, how her units included Russians, Ukrainians, Jews, and Central Asians fighting together without discrimination. These comments alarm American officials who fear she's spreading communist propaganda, but Pavlichenko simply views them as factual observations about contradictions she sees in American society. The tour organizers learn to keep her away from situations that might produce diplomatically awkward truthfulness.
By October 1942, after 2 months touring America and Canada, Pavlichenko returns to the Soviet Union, carrying gifts, letters, and a transformed understanding of the Western world. She's raised significant funds and goodwill for Soviet war relief, met thousands of Americans, and become one of the most recognizable Soviet figures in the West. But she's also exhausted by the performance aspects of propaganda work, tired of being treated as a curiosity rather than a soldier, and eager to return to roles she understands. Soviet command has other plans. Pavlichenko's combat days are over. She's too valuable as a symbol to risk, and besides, her injuries from Sevastopol have left her with chronic pain that would affect her shooting accuracy. Instead, she's assigned to train new snipers, passing on techniques learned through 309 kills to the next generation of Soviet marksmen. She accepts this reassignment with mixed feelings, understanding its necessity, but missing the clarity of purpose that combat provided. The woman who once had to prove she could shoot to earn a rifle now finds herself teaching others to kill as efficiently as she did, turning the practical experience of taking 309 lives into doctrine that will help others take thousands more. Lady Death has come home from America, transformed from active killer to teacher of killing, from soldier to symbol, carrying both Eleanor Roosevelt's pistol and the knowledge that her war, at least the part where she personally pulls triggers, has ended at age 25.
1943 to 1945. Soviet sniper training facilities. Lyudmila Pavlichenko spends the remainder of World War II teaching new snipers the craft that made her legendary. But those who work closely with her notice changes that combat has etched into her personality. She suffers from what Soviet military doctors call shell shock, but what later generations will recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Loud noises make her flinch. She struggles with sleep, often waking from nightmares about Sevastopol. Students who make careless mistakes during training face verbal fury that seems disproportionate until someone explains that Pavlichenko watches every student through the lens of combat reality, knowing that mistakes in training mean death in battle. She's particularly harsh about students who romanticize sniping or view it as sport rather than killing. One cadet who brags about wanting to rack up a high score like Pavlichenko finds himself facing her cold stare as she describes in graphic detail what a human body looks like through a scope at the moment a bullet impacts. The romanticism dies quickly under her instruction, replaced by sober understanding that sniping means taking lives, not scoring points. The psychological burden of 309 confirmed kills manifests in ways Pavlichenko struggles to articulate, even to people close to her. In private moments, she admits that she remembers faces, not all 309, but many of them. German soldiers seen through her scope in the seconds before she pulled the trigger. Young men who might have been students or farmers or fathers in peacetime, turned into enemies by Hitler's aggression, but still human beings whose lives she ended. Pavlichenko develops a defensive mental framework to process this guilt, emphasizing repeatedly in interviews and memoirs that she killed fascist invaders who were destroying her homeland, that every German she killed meant Soviet civilians who might survive. This framework is psychologically necessary, but never quite sufficient. A fellow veteran and friend later recalls Pavlichenko saying during a vodka-fueled late-night conversation that the first kill haunted her most not because it was hardest, but because it was when she learned she could kill, and that knowledge couldn't be unknown. Soviet propaganda machinery uses Pavlichenko extensively during and after the war, transforming her from a person into a symbol of Soviet military prowess and gender equality. She's featured in newsreels, newspapers, and posters, always depicted as the perfect Soviet woman warrior, beautiful, deadly, ideologically pure. The propaganda version of Pavlichenko bears little resemblance to the complicated, traumatized veteran struggling with what she experienced. Official accounts emphasize her kills and heroism, while sanitizing the psychological cost, the injuries, the exhaustion, and the moral complexity of taking 309 lives. Pavlichenko participates in this propaganda because Soviet citizens don't refuse state requests, and because part of her believes that her story might inspire others or honor fallen comrades. But she also resents how propaganda reduces her combat experience to simple heroic narrative, stripping away the nuance and horror that defined what she actually endured. Friends note that she drinks heavily after propaganda appearances, needing alcohol to numb the dissonance between her lived experience and the sanitized version the state presents. After the war ends in 1945, Pavlichenko completes her university degree in history, the education interrupted by war, finally finished at age 29. She joins the Soviet Navy as a research assistant, eventually rising to the rank of major, a position that provides stable employment and veteran benefits but feels utterly disconnected from her wartime identity. She marries and divorces, relationships complicated by her combat trauma, and the fact that she's famous in ways that make normal domestic life impossible. Soviet citizens recognize her on the street. Veterans want to meet the legendary Lady Death, and foreign journalists periodically seek interviews about her American tour or her kills. Pavlichenko tries to maintain privacy and normalcy, but finds herself perpetually defined by 8 months of combat that occurred when she was 24 and 25. Her entire subsequent life overshadowed by 309 deaths she caused before age 26. She later tells an interviewer that the war lasted 4 years for the Soviet Union, but for her it never really ended, that she carried Sevastopol with her every day for the rest of her life. The Cold War transforms Pavlichenko into an ideological symbol for both sides, a process she watches with weary resignation. In the West, particularly America, she becomes evidence of Soviet female empowerment, a talking point for feminists who cite her as proof that women can succeed in traditionally male domains. Soviet propaganda uses her to demonstrate socialist gender equality compared to capitalist societies. Neither side particularly cares about Pavlichenko the person, the woman who wakes up from nightmares about faces seen through scopes, who struggles with chronic pain from Sevastopol injuries, who drinks too much and feels increasingly isolated by fame she never sought. Eleanor Roosevelt maintains occasional correspondence through the 1950s and 60s, one of the few relationships from Pavlichenko's American tour that survives into genuine friendship. Roosevelt's letters, carefully worded to pass Soviet censors, express concern for Pavlichenko's well-being and remind her that she has friends in the West. These letters become treasured possessions, evidence that someone sees past the propaganda to the complicated human underneath. By the 1960s and 70s, Pavlichenko has become a historical figure rather than an active participant in Soviet public life, trotted out for occasional commemorations and interviews, but otherwise left alone.
She gives measured, careful interviews where she emphasizes justified defense of the motherland while avoiding the psychological reality of killing. Western journalists who interview her, expecting bloodthirsty boasts, are often surprised by her reluctance to glorify what she did, her insistence that war is horror rather than adventure. A British journalist in 1969 notes that Pavlichenko seems profoundly sad when discussing her combat service, as if she's describing something that happened to someone else, a younger woman who could still believe that killing 309 people might be a form of heroism rather than tragedy made necessary by Hitler's aggression. The journalist asks if she's proud of her record. Pavlichenko pauses for a long time before answering through her translator that pride is the wrong word. It was that she did what needed doing and survived when many did not, but that she would trade every medal and honor to undo the circumstances that made 309 kills necessary. The interview never airs in its entirety, deemed too philosophically complex for audiences expecting simple warrior narratives.
October 10, 1974. Moscow. Lyudmila Pavlichenko dies at age 58 from a stroke, her death coming unexpectedly despite years of health problems stemming from combat injuries and chronic alcoholism. The woman who survived German bullets, artillery barrages, and 8 months in Sevastopol's hell is killed by the accumulated physical and psychological toll of a war that ended 29 years earlier. Soviet authorities announce her death with full military honors, praising her as a hero of the Soviet Union and one of history's greatest snipers. Western media reports her passing with variations of the same headline, "Lady Death has died." But the obituaries struggled to capture the complexity of Pavlichenko's life, reducing her to statistics about 309 kills, while missing the decades of trauma, the friendships that transcended Cold War divisions, and the philosophical struggle with being history's most successful female killer. Friends who attend her funeral notice that even in death, Pavlichenko cannot escape being defined by 8 months of combat that happened when she was barely older than a college student. The Soviet state funeral celebrates Pavlichenko as a symbol, while carefully avoiding the uncomfortable truths about what those 309 kills cost her personally. Government officials deliver speeches about Soviet heroism and women's equality under socialism, using her death as an opportunity to score ideological points against the West. Veterans who served with Pavlichenko attend the funeral and tell different stories, describing a woman who drank heavily to silence memories, who woke screaming from nightmares decades after Sevastopol, who struggled with depression that Soviet medicine had no tools to treat effectively. These stories don't make it into official eulogies because they complicate the narrative of glorious Soviet warrior woman. The disconnect between public commemoration and private reality has defined Pavlichenko's entire post-war existence, and it continues even as her body lies in state. One veteran tells a Western journalist that Pavlichenko died decades ago at Sevastopol, that the woman who returned was a ghost who spent 32 years trying to rejoin the living but never quite managed. Eleanor Roosevelt, who has maintained irregular correspondence with Pavlichenko despite Cold War tensions, issues a statement from New York expressing grief at losing a friend she describes as one of history's most remarkable women. Roosevelt's statement carefully navigates political sensitivities, praising Pavlichenko's courage while avoiding Soviet talking points about socialism's superiority.
The statement reveals that Roosevelt and Pavlichenko exchanged letters as recently as 1973, discussing mundane topics like grandchildren and health problems. Two elderly women who once faced each other across an ideological divide but found genuine friendship. Roosevelt mentions the Colt pistol she gave Pavlichenko in 1942, wondering if it remained one of her prized possessions. Soviet officials neither confirm nor deny this detail, uncomfortable with highlighting American connections, even in death. Western feminists who embraced Pavlichenko as an icon of female capability issue their own tributes, often missing the irony that their celebration of a woman who killed 309 people somewhat undermines arguments about women being naturally less violent than men. Pavlichenko's legacy proves immediately contested, with different groups claiming her memory for contradictory purposes. Soviet propagandists hold her up as proof that communism liberated women to achieve greatness impossible under capitalism. Western feminists cite her as evidence that women can excel in any field, including combat, using her record to argue for women's integration into military roles. Pacifists use her story as a cautionary tale about war's psychological costs, pointing to her post-traumatic stress and alcoholism as evidence that even successful soldiers are damaged by killing. Military historians debate her tactical innovations and whether her kill count truly ranks among the highest, or if Soviet record-keeping inflated numbers for propaganda purposes. None of these interpretations particularly cares about Pavlichenko the person, the complicated woman who existed beyond the various causes people enlist her memory to serve. Her son, Rostislav, attending her funeral, expresses frustration that his mother has become a political football even in death, with everyone claiming to understand what she represents, while few bothered to understand who she actually was. The historical assessment of Pavlichenko's military career acknowledges both her exceptional skill and the unique circumstances that allowed her success. She operated during a period when Soviet forces were desperate enough to deploy women in combat roles, despite institutional sexism, when German forces were fighting on multiple fronts and couldn't devote unlimited resources to counter-sniper operations, and when Wehrmacht officer casualties were already high enough that Soviet snipers targeting leaders produced outsized tactical effects. Her 309 confirmed kills represents genuine achievement, placing her among the most successful snipers of any gender in any military. But historians also note that Soviet confirmation standards were looser than German requirements, that wartime conditions made verification difficult, and that some political pressure existed to inflate numbers for propaganda purposes. Most serious military analysts conclude that even if her actual total was lower, say 250 or 275, Pavlichenko remains one of history's deadliest individual soldiers, a woman whose rifle inflicted more enemy casualties than entire platoons managed in some engagements. The ultimate verdict on Pavlichenko's life must grapple with profound moral and psychological questions about what war does to individuals and whether killing 309 people, even enemy soldiers, can coexist with maintaining one's humanity. Pavlichenko herself seemed uncertain about this answer, oscillating between pride in having defended her homeland effectively and horror at having taken so many lives. Her story demonstrates that war damages everyone it touches, that even winners suffer psychological wounds that never fully heal, that societies celebrate warriors while failing to address the trauma combat inevitably creates. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko was buried at WWII cemetery in Moscow with full military honors, salutes from honor guards, and speeches about eternal glory, She joined thousands of other Soviet veterans whose official commemoration ignored the private anguish behind public heroism. The history student who once had to prove she could shoot became Lady Death, who proved it 309 times and spent 30 years trying to become human again and never quite succeeding. Her grave marker lists her military rank, her Hero of the Soviet Union medal, and her dates of birth and death, but says nothing about the 309 ghosts she carried to that grave. Nothing about the trauma that killed her decades after surviving combat. Nothing about the cost of being history's deadliest woman. Perhaps that silence is appropriate. Perhaps there are no words adequate to capture what it means to kill 309 people and spend the rest of your life wondering if you're a hero or a monster, and concluding that you might be both.
50 years after Pavlichenko's death, her story experiences renewed attention as debates about women in combat intensify worldwide, with military forces from America to Israel to Ukraine citing her as historical precedent for female combat effectiveness. Modern feminist writers hold up Pavlichenko as proof that women can match or exceed men in traditionally male domains, using her 309 confirmed kills to challenge assumptions about gender and violence. But this celebration often strips away context and complexity, transforming Pavlichenko from a traumatized veteran who struggled with what she'd done into a simple icon of female empowerment. Ukrainian commemorations after 2022 claim Pavlichenko as a national hero defending against Russian aggression, creating uncomfortable irony since she fought for the Soviet Union that Ukraine now opposes. Russian authorities simultaneously claim her as evidence of Soviet military glory, ignoring that the system she served also imprisoned and executed millions. The woman who wanted to be remembered as a history student who did what necessity demanded has instead become a contested symbol that everyone interprets through their own ideological lens. Military training programs worldwide study Pavlichenko's tactics as part of sniper doctrine development, with her techniques for camouflage, target selection, and patience under fire becoming standard instruction in multiple armies. American, British, Israeli, and other military sniper schools teach case studies based on her Sevastopol operations, analyzing how she survived 8 months of counter-sniper warfare while maintaining exceptional effectiveness. Modern snipers using technology Pavlichenko couldn't imagine, thermal optics, laser rangefinders, precision rifles with effective ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, still learn from her fundamental insights about reading terrain, controlling breathing, and maintaining psychological discipline during extended operations. Canadian sniper instructors cite her emphasis on shot discipline, noting that Pavlichenko's relatively modest daily kill counts reflected her refusal to take shots that might compromise her position, a lesson that keeps modern snipers alive. The tactical legacy proves more straightforward than the moral one, because military professionals can extract useful lessons without grappling with whether killing 309 people represents heroism or tragedy. The feminist appropriation of Pavlichenko's story creates philosophical tensions that she herself seemed to recognize during her lifetime. Modern feminists who celebrate her combat achievements while opposing militarism must reconcile how praising someone for killing 309 people fits with anti-violence principles. Some argue that Pavlichenko represents justified defensive violence, killing fascist invaders threatening her homeland, making her violence morally different from aggressive warfare. Others contend that celebrating any killer, regardless of cause, undermines feminist arguments about women bringing different, less violent perspectives to traditionally male spheres.
Pavlichenko's own statements during her life suggest she would reject being reduced to feminist icon, having repeatedly emphasized that she killed out of necessity rather than desire, and that war damaged everyone, regardless of gender. One of her last interviews includes the observation that people who celebrate warriors usually haven't experienced war, that those who've actually killed tend to view it as tragedy made necessary by evil, rather than glorious achievement. This nuance rarely survives translation into modern political discourse, where Pavlichenko becomes a data point in arguments about female combat capability. The psychological cost of Pavlichenko's combat service provides crucial context that military forces historically ignored, but increasingly must address as understanding of combat trauma improves. Modern military mental health professionals study historical cases like Pavlichenko's to understand PTSD's long-term effects, how even successful warriors suffer psychological damage that civilian society struggles to accommodate. Her alcoholism, nightmares, and chronic depression represent common patterns among soldiers who kill repeatedly, outcomes that undermine romanticized warrior narratives. American veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan report symptoms similar to what Pavlichenko described: intrusive memories of faces seen through scopes, moral injury from having taken lives, difficulty reconciling killer identity with civilian self-concept. Mental health advocates cite Pavlichenko's story as evidence that societies must provide better support for veterans dealing with killing's psychological aftermath, that celebrating warriors while ignoring their trauma constitutes a form of societal cruelty. The woman who spent 30 decades haunted by 309 kills becomes, in this framework, not just a sniper, but a cautionary tale about war's inevitable psychological costs. The historical debate about Pavlichenko's actual kill count, while somewhat beside the point, given that even conservative estimates place her among history's deadliest soldiers, raises important questions about propaganda versus reality in wartime reporting. Soviet documentation of sniper kills was less rigorous than German standards, confirmations sometimes based on single witness statements rather than physical verification. Some historians suggest Pavlichenko's actual total might have been 200 to 250 rather than 309, still exceptional, but inflated for propaganda purposes. Others defend the 309 figure, noting that her kills were documented in military logbooks and verified by spotters and commanders. The debate matters less for assessing her individual capability than for understanding how warfare generates myths that serve state purposes. Pavlichenko became a propaganda tool while she was alive, her story shaped by Soviet ideological needs, regardless of exact accuracy. What remains certain is that she was an extraordinarily effective sniper who inflicted significant enemy casualties during critical defensive operations, whether the precise number was 309 or something lower. The final assessment of Lyudmila Pavlichenko's life and legacy must acknowledge a fundamental tragedy that transcends questions of feminism, military effectiveness, or propaganda. A talented, intelligent young woman who wanted to study history found herself in circumstances where her most valuable skill was killing people. She proved capable of this killing, perhaps more capable than she wished, and that capability defined the rest of her life in ways that prevented her from being anything else. The history student who fought to earn a rifle became Lady Death who could never fully return to being Lyudmila. Her story demonstrates war's power to transform individuals, to take someone capable of studying the past and make them an instrument for ending futures, to extract capabilities people didn't know they possessed and leave psychological scars that never heal. 50 years after her death, Lyudmila Pavlichenko remains simultaneously a feminist icon, a military case study, a propaganda symbol, and a cautionary tale about war's human costs. Perhaps the most honest way to remember her as a woman who did what she believed necessary to defend her homeland, who paid an enormous psychological price for her effectiveness, and who spent decades trying to reconcile the killer she became with the person she wished to be. The 309 German soldiers she killed remained forever dead, but so did, in a sense, the Lyudmila Pavlichenko who existed before pulling that first trigger in August 1941. Lady Death survived the war, but the history student did not. And that loss of self, the transformation from human being into weapon and back into haunted veteran, represents war's most profound cost, one that transcends nationality, gender, or cause. Pavlichenko's ghost persists not because 309 is an impressive number, but because her story forces us to confront what we ask of people in wartime and what they become when they deliver.